And just very briefly, I'm going to talk about why write tests. So I have some points here, like, the most obvious one is like you want to be confident that your code's working, and that's why people want to write tests to help know that your code's working. But the other thing, there's other things that make writing tests really great. One is that as you write tests more and more, you'll start to write more testable code. And this is like kind of out of the scope of this discussion, but like you'll find that like a function that does one thing is very easy to test, whereas a function that does 15 things is really hard to test. So similarly, if you have a React component that's doing 15 different kinds of things depending on what happens, that's going to be really hard to write a test for. And like you'll gradually just start to write more and more testable code or easy to understand React components, and you'll find that writing tests kind of improves how you write code at the same time. Writing tests also makes you think about edge cases. There's nothing just like to sit down and write a bunch of tests. You're like, oh, like what are the things I'm testing for? So you naturally kind of think about writing, like thinking about the edge cases of your feature. And also tests are really important to document how your code works. And that's a kind of a really interesting topic that's sort of outside of the scope of this workshop, but like there is kind of an art form to writing really readable test code. So you shouldn't just write tests that like, they work and they pass and they prove your feature works. Like your test should actually kind of show people how to use your components together. So there's like really great guides on that I'll link to later. Another thing I want to talk about is that there's sort of these paradigms of testing. So one that came along a bit earlier was this concept of a testing pyramid. So you have tons and tons of unit tests, and then you have slightly less integration tests, and then even fewer end-to-end tests. And that was kind of like this paradigm that's been around for years and years. But more recently with front-end development, there's this concept of a testing trophy. So with the testing trophy, there's static testing, which is stuff like Prettier and ESLint. And for people who lint their CSS, there's like style lint, and then there's like using TypeScript. So that falls under the static category. And then in front-end testing, often like your unit tests aren't as important as having more integration tests. Like having more integration tests will give you confidence that like your features are all working, your components are all working together as planned. So like I've definitely like had this in the past where I've written like tons and tons of unit tests for like a form, but the form still doesn't work because I needed to write more integration tests of how like say my form validators work with my form fields, and like I neglected to do that, and then so the feature's still like kind of weird and buggy. Yeah, and then again you want to have like fewer end-to-end tests just because they're really expensive to write. Another thing that comes up, and it's like a lot of people don't explicitly tell you, but there's actually this testing pattern called act, arrange, assert. So, in React where you see the word act, that's actually part of this pattern. And then depending on the code base you're in, you'll see these arrange functions. And for asserts, that's when you have expect. So if expect this function to equal true, that's your assertion. So I've linked to this link here, and actually just want to share it in the chat really quick. This is like a really great guide, and you can read a little more about the act, arrange, assert pattern there. And then, but yeah, arrange functions are usually functions you write on your own. It's like setup code. If you have common mocks, you keep writing it over and over again for a bunch of tests on your page, you put that into your arrange function. It's also a good place to render your component and return any selectors that are used in tests over and over again. And I'll show an example of what this looks like in a minute. Act is when you execute your test. It's usually a few lines. For example, when you click a button or you fill out a form. The act function is really important too when you're running asynchronous tests, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And assert is anytime you see the keyword expect, that's the assertion. So basically every test has three parts. It has an arrange where it sets up everything that's going to get rendered in your test. And then you have the act section where you're clicking on a button or you're filling out your form. And then it has assertions where you assert that your component is working the way it's supposed to. Yeah, any questions on any of this stuff so far? I'm just looking up in the chat in case. Yeah, okay.
I have a question, actually. When you say expect something dot to be visible, is this something a component?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes I guess I'm thinking of like, when you have like a toggle and like it might like turn something on and off, or if you have a drop down and you have a drop down button and it opens and closes the drop down. So yeah, to be visible is actually, I think it's in this library called Just DOM, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but there's tons of different assertions. Like ones you've probably seen a lot are like to be or to equal. Yeah.
So what I'm gathering then is that like when you have an expected behavior outcome and you populate the expect parameter with a component, then you're able to like run a whole set of like methods on that expected outcome.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll show a bit of just DOM too, because I think it's like, I don't use it all the time, but it does come in like pretty handy for very specific DOM element tests. Like if you're checking to see if something's visible or not visible, it's really good for focus or disabled or checking for certain styles. So a bit about the arrange functions. They're useful for repeated code. So you'll see what I mean in a minute. But like it makes the test easier to read. So if you have some setup function that's happening at the beginning of every test and you have 10 tests in a single file, that's a good case where you kind of want to abstract that stuff into a function and then you just call the function over and over again. So that way people's eyes aren't tripping over all this setup code that's kind of like unrelated to the actual test. The good thing about arrange functions is you can pass in arguments to customize. So let's say you're rendering a component for many tests over and over, but the props need to change slightly per test. You can pass in those props as an argument and then use that same function over and over for different tests. You'll sometimes see this function called setup or render component. So as an example, Adobe Spectrum, it's like Adobe's design system. If you look into their source code, they call it render component. So yeah. This is kind of what a setup function or a range function or render component function will look like. It'll take, props, it'll render them, and you can do utils get by label text, but you should really be using screen, but I'll get back to that in a minute. But when you use render in React testing library, it actually returns a whole bunch of utilities and you can use them from there. But lately you're supposed to use screen. But as an example, you can return the input because maybe you want to use this cost input a lot. You need to focus and type and do stuff inside of that input. You can return it from this function and then go do things with it. One last testing theory kind of thing I want to touch on really briefly is test titles. Because usually when you're busy getting your test running, you kind of put in a temporary title, and I'm like super guilty of this. It's like I'll put in a temporary title thinking I'll fix it later, and then like I just like post a PR, and then people are like, why is your test title like this? And it's because there's no linter to tell you that your test title is well written. So like, yeah, test titles should have like 3 sections, right? It should tell you what you're testing, the circumstances that you're testing, and the expectation. And that sort of matches that whole like, this is the act part of your test, this is the assert part of your test, and then the arrange part of your test is the what of your test, right? So I do encourage you to like, try to write like grammatically good test titles that are like, that address like the what, the circumstances, and the expectations. And it takes a little extra time, but it's just like, once you know your test is working, just like try to go back and fix those test titles and kind of try to imagine the person who's reading this test like 6 months from now. Like if that test is breaking, they need to know how to fix it. Like try to put that into the title. I'm gonna do a quick, let me just check actually. Yeah, I'm gonna do a partial walkthrough of the app right now. So just to show you a bit about how selecting works. So if I do npm, I think it's npm start. Let's see. So this is gonna start up, running it on parcel, and this is the form. And so basically, I have like a fake API call happening that fetches data, and it's pre-populated these fields with deliberately bad data. So if it's today's date or it has invalid in this text box and I hit submit, it won't let me submit the form and it'll give me some error messages. And then if I go and put the date ahead of today's date, actually, let me look. I defaulted this to February, so I need to actually make it like way ahead. So let's say I make it here, and then I type in hello world, and then I hit submit. That'll take me to the successful state of the form. And then to reset it, like you can just hit refresh. So this is like a pretty contrived form. There's some stuff in the form code I would be like, never build an actual form this way. It's just that I wanted to build something that has lots of mocks so I could show how to write mocks. So yeah, and also not a very strong designer. So this is the testing playground tool. And there's a couple of gotchas with this tool. So like when you click on it, you think it would highlight. Okay, so the first thing is that there's two icons that look very similar. And then the top one is actually your dev tool. So don't click on that one. You need to click on the one below. And then when you click on it, it doesn't tell you that it's clicked. Like it doesn't change color, which is a little weird. So now it's not working, right? But if I click it again, you'll see that it's gone and selected something for me. And then that's the selector. So let me do it again, just so you can see. So I click here, it doesn't tell you it's clicked. And now when you go, I can go and select the input, and it'll tell you that you can get that, select that element by doing screen get by label text. So we're going to do more of this kind of selecting. But yeah, this is a really great tool because like this, I feel like this only came out in the last few months. And then before this, I was like struggling, trying to figure out how to select something. And then like you'd run the test and like you wouldn't know if you're selecting. And now you actually have a dev tool to do it. So I think that's really great. I think also the other thing you have to pay attention to when using this tool is that there's a priority that React testing library tells you to use. And let me link to this if you want to look. But the important thing is that you should actually always be trying to use get by role first. If that exists. And then the next one you should use is get by label text. And because you'll see in other like older tests, like people are using get by test ID. But like that's, according to this priority list, that's the last one you should be using. So try to stick to the first two. And if you use this dev tool, it'll make sure you're using the right selector. Let's see here. Okay.
Might I interrupt? Like, is there a reason why we want to use like screen dot get by role and get by label as opposed to get by text? Like, what are the like, you know, immediate wins, or like what are the safe bets for doing so?
So I guess using the get by role is to ensure that you're using ARIA roles in your markup. So ARIA is part of like accessibility, and not like an accessibility expert, but like having the right ARIA roles makes your app work a bit better for people with screen readers or people who are trying to use the app with a keyboard as opposed to a mouse. So
so you're like addressing the role of that element first, as opposed to like you're just checking for a specific kind of text, and that text could be different.
Yeah. So it's, I guess the reason they do that is to encourage that, you know, you're also writing an accessible like sort of front end app and not just like using a bunch of divs that you can select in your tests. So that's part of how like React testing libraries philosophy, like trying to encourage good testing practices, but also good like front end practices.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so I have, you should try to use screen, which we'll go into in a bit, but like if you're using testing playground dev tools, they'll just tell you to use screen. So you'll just kind of naturally use it. Again, use get by role when possible. So I've linked out to that priority list. That's where that link goes. So you can take a look at that. Oh, my slides. This is a weird thing. So sometimes you need to test if a DOM element is not on the page. So like you've done something and then something should disappear and you want to test that it's not there. That's when you have to use this query called query by text. And it's just a weird gotcha, like that you'll find, like, because certain queries in testing library throw errors and this one doesn't. So if you try to use get by role for something that doesn't exist on the page to test that it's no longer there, then your test will just throw an error and like fail. So you have to use query by text. So it's just like this weird thing. How to trigger events. So a lot of times when you're doing a front end test, like you have to, click on a button or type some text. So for that, you can use the fire event. And there's also this user events library. So I'm just going to link to it. And that's really good because it lets you do certain things that are like a little harder to do just using fire event, like double clicks and hovers, especially are really hard to do with fire event. So that's when you can use this user events library. And it's actually part of testing library. So it's a little confusing, but like testing library is not just one big library. It's like a bunch of little packages. And that way, like you don't have to like download this huge bundle if you're not using it. Like you can just use the packages that you're using. So they've broken it into smaller packages. When to use selectors like get by role, but the specific ID only for testing purposes. Yeah, like I think if I'm reading the question correctly, you should use get by role as much as humanly possible. Like there are going to be weird edge cases where you might have to use a testing ID. But if you can see in like this priority list, where did it go? Yeah, so they have these guiding principles. They suggest that you should use get by role and get by label text. Like these ones are the ones you should use the most, and the test IDs are the ones you should use the least. Like only if you can't find any other way to select that DOM element.
Yeah, because that role attribute is really what parses like what that element's used for, as far as I understood. And the whole like event of like loading a page. Whereas like text IDs, these are, I mean, they're unique supposedly to the HTML element, but a lot of times they're not named the best way. You have button ID 1, button ID 2, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like, it can be a little confusing because like the person who wrote testing library used to do testing workshops where they use test ID quite often. And then they kind of changed their mind. And so this priority list is a fairly recent thing. This recommendation to use get by role is not like, it's not that's something that's been around for years and years. It's like something that happened in the last year or something. So another library I want to
know.
Yeah,
that's really good to know, because like even people who write these things that become like really contemporary and cool, like they're working with feedback from other people.
Yeah. And if you start a job and people are using test IDs all over the place, don't be like, because that was the best practice a few years ago or something. It's weird. Just DOM is like another small library that's part of testing library. And it's useful for a couple things. Like I use like to be visible, like if you want to make sure DOM elements on screen. And then I use the focus one a lot because it's like, it's a little hard to test for focus without using this library. I think there's a disabled one too. But yeah, sometimes you need to do like tests that are like a little more in the DOM and not just like, these are kind of useful. They come up in certain cases, they're very convenient. So I just want to let people know about it.
Yeah, it's such a wide field. I find that when you take like an accessibility specific approach, you find out all these nuances with the method types to use with the tests, as opposed to functionally, it's like, oh yeah, just got to make sure that the class that represents the state that's passed in is showing up.
Yeah, I guess that comes up a lot with like keyboard stuff, when you're tabbing across and you want to make sure certain elements are focused in a certain order. So, Zoom has this weird thing where it's like the arrow buttons only sometimes work. So the next section we're going to cover, and it's quite a few slides, are mocking. Because mocking is, in my opinion, one of the hardest parts about writing tests. So I think the first thing is like just kind of why mock. So we mock a lot in unit tests, and we mock like we try to mock less in integration tests, but mocks also like, it's just in general, like writing good tests and writing lots of tests, they help you pass PR review, and good tests help explain your code to reviewers, and good mocks make your tests less flaky. So we're not just going to talk about mocking, but like there's also such a thing as writing a good mock and a bad mock. So a bad mock will only pass some of the time. And like a good mock will pass every time you run the test. And so we'll kind of talk about that in a bit. And like, yeah, like the worst part of like the most unfun part of writing tests is trying to write your mocks. And then so once you get a little more comfortable with writing mocks, it actually makes writing your tests a lot more fun, which is why I want to kind of spend a bit of time talking about it. There's also very good reasons to not mock. Like, for example, your end-to-end tests shouldn't have mocks, right? It should be testing everything that's real in the app. And it's if you have a bunch of unit tests that have tons of mocks, but you have no end-to-end tests, that won't give you a lot of confidence that your app is really working. And similarly, if you have integration tests that have tons and tons of mocks, like it's possible to be accidentally testing your mocks instead of testing your actual code. Especially if your code is like super complicated, like you're on an app that has a lot of tech debt, you could be accidentally writing a test for your mock instead of your real code. So just keep that in mind. It's like mocks are good for like unit tests, and like you should have less mocks for integration tests. I see some, okay, cool. There's also this idea of like global versus local mocks. There are some mocks that you want to have available for all of your tests. For example, data fetching or internationalization. If you have internationalization throughout your entire app, like you're using React INTL, you'll probably want to make that a module that like is just automatically mocked for like all of your tests in your app. And then those should be in an underscore mocks folder. So that's not just like a coding convention, that's like a Jest thing. So if you have this like double underscore mocks folder, that's like where people are putting in mocks that should be used throughout the entire app or just throughout that entire folder, like depending on where that mocks folder is. A bit about what to mock. So you mock props. You should definitely mock dates, especially like date now. That comes up a lot. And I'm going to show you an older way of mocking date, but there's a newer way. So I touch on that. If you're using set interval or clear interval or set timeout or clear timeout in your tests, you'll want to mock timers in Jest. API calls you should mock. I've linked to this external article, this Kent Dodd's article, like saying it's basically like large applications should have special mocks for the API that expect specific requests. So sometimes you'll see people like they reach for like, you know, mock fetch or Axios, mocks Axios, like whatever mock exists for their fetching library. But like sometimes you want to have a specialized one for your app that expects certain things in the request body so that you know that like your front end is sending the right request to the back end. You also need to mock like local storage, global variables. Global variables are like third-party libraries and any dependencies your component uses. So we're going to kind of go through that. In terms of mocking, good libraries will provide documentation on how to write tests. So they'll usually have some snippets of like, hey, this is how you write a mock when you're using our library. But not every library does that. So for them, I would recommend looking at the test folder. So this is where it's good to not just read documentation. If the documentation for whatever library you're using doesn't have testing instructions, sometimes you can go to their GitHub repo and click on the test folder, and that'll show you kind of how to use it. So let's see. Oh, yeah. Okay, so mocking props. I just have the simplest example here. Let's say you have a component that takes text. You can just mock it by like passing in some string like hello. And then, so mocks are pretty straightforward. This is like a really example, like simple example. If your component has 20 props, it's going to be like more complicated. Mocking date. So this comes up a lot because sometimes you write a lot of functions that are like, you know, you get today's date and then you do some kind of comparison and then you spit out like a result. So it's like, if someone's arriving at your page, like for example, in that form, right? Like if they enter a date that's today's date or earlier, the form submission fails, right? But the problem is these tests run day after day after day. So you don't want it to check today's date if that date's always changing. So usually in tests, you'll find that date's getting hard-coded to something. Another time this kind of gets flaky is like the test will work on your computer with today's date, but then you'll push it to CI and it stops working, or you push it to a server, and that's because the server has a different time than your local computer, right? So you'll have the situation where the tests are working on your computer, but then they fail in the cloud somewhere. So this is like really an important reason why you should be like hard coding the date. I've also seen functions that, anyways, I won't go into that because it's a little complicated. For mocking timers, you want to use just use fake timer. So if your code is like using clear timeout or set timeout, I can't remember the error message, but it's like pretty bad. Like if you don't use just fake timers, you'll get an error message in Jest that doesn't make a lot of sense. So if your code's using that, you're testing that code, use just fake timers. This other one I want to talk about, because this is another way to mock date, but it's only for just 26 and up, which is just set system time. And then so you can hard code the date here and Jest will know that's the time. Yeah. Mocking the window object gets a little more complicated. So I don't know if I can like show you, maybe someone else can find the related link, but when you have the window object, it's a really big object with a lot of key value pairs on it. And some of those keys are only read only. And then other keys are not read only. So this is where it gets complicated, because if you Google how to mock something on the window, you'll get lots of different responses. And that's just because there's a way to mock read only props, and there's a way to mock non-read only props. So if it's not read only, you can delete and assign the property on the window before the test and restore it after the test. Don't try to mock the entire window object. It's really, really big. TypeScript, we have to use this word declare for values that don't exist. So if you're mocking a third-party library that gets attached to the window object, you have to use this declare keyword, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. Does Jest have a specific library for TypeScript? No. So yeah.
But you can tool it so, because I recently had to.
Yeah.
There's ways around it, but yeah. Not that I'd seen.
Yeah, I have a pretty basic setup for this code along. Like I'm just using parcel, but like I can show you kind of like the testing setup I did for that. So I'll do that when we start the code along. Does that sound good?
Actually, Chiwan, I think you're quite right. What I tried out recently was TS Jest. And then there were like some things to do with Babel.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're going to start with like some basic examples.
Oh, and then you have to use spy-on for only read-only properties. So I'm going to show some code samples. Wait.
I'm quite interested in this spy-on because most tutorials I look at online, they'll just show you that functional unit test, you know, like get by role, you know, find the correct class name that represents the state of the component has been shown, or like, you know, find that like the correct label and the title has been passed in. But like, why use spy on, right? Like when to use spy on versus, for example, passing in like get by role.
Yeah, spy on is good when you want to mock part of something, and like in this case we want to mock like part of the window, but like we want the rest of the stuff to be like the real thing. So so first I'm going to talk about the non-spy-on example, which is location. So location in window is not read-only, which means we can modify it. So before your test, you're going to pull out the location object from the window, and then you're going to delete window.location. And that doesn't delete the whole window. That just deletes the location thing on the window. And then you can set it to whatever you want for your tests. And then after all your tests, you want to set window location back to what it actually is. So that's how you restore it. And this is something I've been glossing over, but like when you run tests, like sometimes you want to mock stuff, but after your tests are done, you want to like turn it back to the real thing, or else like you can screw up someone else's tests. So we're going to talk a bit about this before each and before all and after each and after all, but like just keep in mind that like when you mock stuff in tests, you want to set it back to what it was for the next test, or else like you could screw up your next test. This is actually like the #1 reason your tests start failing. So here is spy. So basically the way spy on works is like the first thing you pass is like usually like an object with a lot of keys, right? And then this is just one thing on that object. So for here, I'm mocking local storage. So I say spy on the window object. And then for local storage, when they call local storage.get, I want to mock that return value at something. And then that'll do that before all my tests. And then after each, I want to reset all mocks. Any questions about this stuff? Because that's a lot of code. So,
and it's an important step to include as a setup to your tests, or you might get memory leaks, or tests running like, out of your control.
So yeah, I don't know why they chose the word spy on. Like, I guess there's this whole concept of mocks versus spies versus stubs, which I'm not super well versed in, because I think spy on and Jest means something different from spies in other testing libraries. But spy on and Jest means that you're only like spying on one thing in that whole file. So like in the window global object, you're only spying on local storage in this example. And with spy, it always calls the real thing under the hood. So even though I'm returning a mock value for local storage here, with spy on, I'm also actually calling local storage, because sometimes you want to do that for a test. So, but most of the time spy on is used when you want to test part of a file, but then use the real stuff from the file. Here's another example. Because this comes up a lot. Like sometimes you just want to mock part of something, but not like the whole file, right? So you'll import star as some file from some file. And that's like, this will import all the like named exports from that file. And then you can spy on some file. And then let's say you exported this one function you want to mock, right? And then you can return the mock return value. And then because I did this let outside of the tests, like I can just use my spied function in all of the tests. This is like, this import star as some file is like one thing I want to like briefly touch on, because like I find in the last few years I'm using less and less default exports, and I think part of it is like why it's because of like how it works with writing tests. Like it's just easier if you just export a bunch of named constants from a file. It makes your test a little easier to write. Or maybe I just don't work with default exports very well. Mocking dependencies. So this is like this weird thing, because like you have to import it and then you have to write just mock. And then there's these two optional points, but that's only if you want to like mock the implementation, like you want to have some completely different function instead of the function that you were mocking. And you can also mock the return value. So just a really simple example, this is JS UUID. I think another version of this library is like Nano, which is more popular, but like it's to mock, it's just to mock like IDs in your app, like UUIDs, right? So this is something that you like want to mock a lot, because like it gives you a different, like if you're actually using the real v4, it gives you a completely different value every time. So in your test, you want to mock this, because if it gives you a different value all the time, your tests are going to keep failing, because like it's expecting something that is always changing. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, UID is a unique identifier. But you see there's two steps here. The first step is that I imported it into my test file. But the next step is that I wrote just mock and add a function returning an object with the same name, right? So it's the same name, then I mocked it. I think this is the last like tough one, is like mocking for use effect, because this one is like several slides. You have to use act with async functions and await. And I'm going to explain a bit of this because there's two parts to this, right? So the first part is how you render. So if you have a component called my component and there's a use effect in there, you have to use the act keyword, and then you have to render that component asynchronously. And that's because like, you know, your component will like mount, and then like, usually the use effect runs asynchronously, like the component mounts, but then something happens and then the use effect runs. These three keywords like that, await, act, async, render, it means all this stuff is going to happen. And then when you write your assertion here, that's after the use effect is run. Okay. And then the other thing with your use effect is that you have to use mock implementation and mock restore. Like if you want to fake, this is like, especially for API calls, you're like faking what you return. So it kind of looks like this, right? So like, let's say I'm importing, like my API module does all my fetching. So I mock it, and then I do spy on because I only want to spy on get. And then I have a fake response that comes back from when I call get. So inside of the test, I might do get mock implementation, promise resolve, response mock, right? And then in between my tests, either in my before each or after all, I'll just restore it. So yeah, so 2 steps. It's like when you render your component, make sure you use act with async and await, and then also spy on like that module that's doing the stuff. So anyways, I think that's about it. So I think we're going to go to the code along part. So you should see, I'm just going to run through the, if I look at the Babel, the Jest config, yeah, it's just I think I have a Babel set up here. Maybe I didn't bring it in. Oh, here it is. Yeah, Babel config. Yeah, so I used that at Babel preset TypeScript, and then that was basically it. And then I think I had a really minimal TS config. Oh, and then for lint stage, you just have to make sure you throw in like the TypeScript files too, and then that should work. Yeah. So if people are following along, there's a finished folder. And if you look here, that's like the working code. So if you're following along and your code's not working, you can just kind of copy and paste stuff from finished. So we have 3 tests here. So if we go back to the app here, so I want to test 3 things. So the first one is should render fetch data from the API local storage. So if you see here how it says hello world, and I have some emojis here, and then this gets pre-populated. If I go to the form code, I have a message like never make a form this way, but like there's basically, I go and fetch data, and then I use that to set the date and the text. And then if I go, where is it? Yeah. Okay, sorry, I'm just looking at the chat really quick. Yeah, and then I also have a fake third-party library that's showing this hello world stuff. That's this thing here. And I also set something in local storage, and then in the actual form, I'm grabbing those values and I'm putting that into the form. So I'm just using local storage, I'm getting that item, and this is what's coming from local storage. This is coming from a fake third-party library, and then I'm doing a fake API call to like pre-populate this data. So if we go to the test, that's going to be the first test. Should render fetch the data from the API, local storage, and global display the data. And then it should, the next one is that error state I was talking about. So if I submit the form, I'm going to test that this error state is working if the data is invalid. And then the last test is for if the data is valid, it should get this form submitted successfully. So it should display a success message with valid data on form submit. So if you open up your terminal here, I think if I do npm test, and I have to do npm form. And then if you type watch, it'll kind of keep running your tests. So let's see how this works. The first time it runs, it takes really long. And then usually after that, when it catches a change, so if you press save, it'll run the test again. So right now, everything's kind of passing, but that's because nothing's actually happening. So there is a keyword called only. And if I do that, it should skip my other tests. That way we could focus on one test at a time. So you see these 2 are skipped here, right? So we're going to write the first test. So you can see I have an arrange function, which is using await act async render form. And that's because if you go to your form, go to the form I built, it's because there's a use effect and it's doing an API, like an asynchronous function call. So if you go there, so I'm just gonna mock out some of the things we need to mock, right? So we have a list here. We have the fake third-party library, the local storage, the fetch, and we need to mock the date. So let's start with the third-party library stuff. So I'm gonna write a before each. So before each runs before every single test. So if I do, I wonder if I can do this to show you. So if I do that, and I hit save, yeah, it doesn't exactly show you in the order I was hoping, but you can see that console log here. So I find like, I don't know about you, but like I find like using emojis in these tests is a little helpful because it's easy to see where your console log is happening. And then, yeah, so we're gonna use, so if you look, I'm just gonna pull up the index here. You can see on the window, we have this fake third-party library, right? So if I copy this part and I go to here, and then I go to global, because in Jest, the window object is actually called global. And then I'm just gonna copy and paste this code here. So I'm gonna copy and paste that, and then put that here. And then I'm gonna, after all my tests, I'm gonna clean that up. So if I do after all, I'm gonna delete global third-party library. So if I do this, probably the test will still pass because this is unrelated. But we're gonna try to see, we're gonna test stuff here. So let's go here. And if I go to refresh, I wanna see that this is here, right? So I'm gonna copy and paste that. And then I'm going to expect it. So if I do expect and I paste that to, and then you have to get the text content. So this is gonna get the DOM element, and then text content will just get it out of your React component. And then I want it to equal exactly that. So I'm just gonna copy and paste this. Okay, now it's mad. Oh, because I did a little h instead of a big H. So I'm gonna do that. Okay. So
And
now,
what you're really showing here is that process of going from like red to green.
yeah. It's kind of like we still have to test for a bunch more selectors, so it's like fake green at the moment. So the next one is this part here with all the poop emojis. So you want to also expect that that's there too. So we're going to write expect, and then in between the blue and the purple, we want to write text content, and we want to make sure it equals the same thing. So if we write that, and we write that here, now it fails, right? So can anyone guess why it's failing? It's failing because we use local storage. So in the form, we go here, we're actually getting a reference to window local storage, and we're displaying that value here inside of the H3, but we actually haven't mocked local storage. So in our index file, we're setting local storage when you, it has a key called yo, and then it's going to return those emojis. So we need to mock that. So let's go up here. Okay, so we've mocked the third-party library, but now we need to mock local storage. So I'm going to do that outside of the form. So we're going to call get local storage. And then if I go in here, I'm gonna do in the before each. Okay, get local storage, and that's gonna be just spy on, like we talked about, window, local storage, get, and that is going to mock the return value, and we're gonna just copy and paste this. Okay. And then we're gonna reset it. So in between our tests, we're gonna have after each, and we're gonna do this just reset all mocks. Okay, so let's see if this works. Oh, just spy on. Oh, I think I have a typo. Storage get item is not a function. Okay.
Is that get item instead of get? The
Oh yes.
Yeah, there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I might have to do this a different way. Like I changed it really recently. So let me see if I have this. Hold on a second. I think, let's see here. If I do this, window local storage, get, but that's not working. Oh yeah, okay. I'm gonna have to Google this because there's another way to mock this before that I was using. So that is a long way, but that is not a great way either. Hold on a second. What is it? I think it's global storage. I guess I'll try this. Let's see. Let's see here. Does anyone have any ideas? Okay. I am apologizing. I have to go back to some of my closed pull requests, and I'm going to modify this. So
It's all good. I have never tried to mock fetching an item from local storage before.
you know, it's interesting because I got this feedback that, okay, so I'll explain it in a minute, but yes, this is how I was doing it before. And maybe I have a different version of Jest accidentally installed. Yes, now it's fine. Okay, so I just want to explain this because that was like a little weird, but like, okay, so you can mock window, but window is like local storage is part of a browser API called the storage API. So you have to mock it this way. But I do like the problem when you do it this way is that it mocks local storage, but it also mocks like your session storage too. So that's mocking more things than you wanted to. So I was trying to make it mock like just local storage specifically. Okay, the next thing is we wanna, if we render, we wanna make sure that the label text exists. So like the date text. So if I go here, so I want to expect that equals like that value. So if I do expect get by label text, and this is where some TypeScript comes up. You have to go as HTML input element dot value, and then dot value. You want it to equal. So it's a 2020 02 01. And then let's see here. I think label text as HTML. So we have expect. I think there is some get my label text. Okay, there is some. Okay, so that should be the inside. And then we have dot value to equal. Okay. Test suite failed to run. So we press save. It's not receiving that date. And that's because we have to mock fetch. So we're gonna go here. We've rendered our form asynchronously, but now we need to, and we've mocked our local storage, but now we need to mock fetch. So if we're mocking fetch, we're gonna have a fake fetch. So just to show you the code again one more time, we have this fake fetch, and then it goes here. So that's what we're fetching. It's like an asynchronous promise that returns something. And then we're going to do just spy on, and we're going to spy on fetch, and we're going to this fake fetch object. So let me just show you this here quick. So yeah, this is a module. We export a constant called fake fetch. That's what we're mocking. So if we go here, we have to make sure we've imported it, which I've imported it earlier. So we're going to do it here. And then before each one, we're going to mock that implementation. So it's going to be fake fetch, mock implementation, and then it's going to be promise resolve. And it's going to be I put this in the wrong place. We want the fetch to be different for each function. So that should actually be in here. So I'm going to do promise resolve. And then this is, we're going to have a response mock, and we're going to resolve it with a response mock here. But that means we're going to pass in a different response mock for each test. So we're going to go here, and then we're going to write a response mock, and then it's going to have this date. Date, and I'm going to say 2020 0201, and I'm going to also mock that text. So it should be loading with invalid. And then we're going to do a range, and we're going to do that response mock. And then we have our just reset all mocks. Okay, so let's see how this works now. Okay. Get by label text, enter date, and it's still empty. And we are mocking the implementation. let's see. Oh yeah, I made this fake call should happen before this async, or else it's not actually fetching the data. Okay, and then that test passed. And then if I go here, it should be loading with this text. So again, this is going to be here. If I go to the end and we type it, we're going to expect screen get by role. And then we have to cast it as HTML input element and then get the value from it. And that should equal invalid. Yeah, and that's our first test. Any questions? Because that was just a lot of select code, and then there's a bit of that mix up with the mocking. So
Yeah, why are you using regex? So those slashes rather than quotes. You know, it's a string. So this is a regex. Is that correct?
yeah, I'm mostly using it because I'm blindly copying and pasting from the dev tool, because the dev tool gives you a regex. So
Okay.
yeah, I think you can like hard code the text, but like if I'm using it and it works, I'm like, cool, like I don't have to worry about selecting. That's mostly like, yeah.
And then in your arrange function, you had to move around the fake fetch. Why does priority matter in this specific case?
So it's like, I guess like, that's a good question, because that's the first time I've done that. And then like basically in my use effect is like the component sort of mounts. Like when you have a use effect with that empty array, it that means like this effect only runs after mount, right? So it runs this fetch data, but if I don't have, it looks like if I don't have fetch data, like the mock implementation there, it'll just actually call the real fetch when this render happens. So it's almost like, I think moving it after is almost like not mocking it. So it's like trying to call the real fetch, and then it's like, oh, that's not working, and like we're not getting a value because like, yeah, so then you have to mock it in order to like consistently get that value.
I see. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. Just as a thing, reset all mocks is like resetting multiple things. So it's resetting this get items by, and it's also resetting the fake fetch, I think. Because yeah. So like if you do, there's differences. So clear all mocks is just for if you're testing if the function's been called. So like if I do clear all mocks here, it's not resetting the return values or like the mock implementations. Oh, it's still working. But yeah. So there's a difference between clear all mocks and reset all mocks and restore all mocks. And I think if you're doing a lot of spy-ons, only restore all mocks works. So yeah. So we're going to go on to the next test, and I'm going to write like kind of the test code first. So if I do it only for two things, it skips the other test. So it's running the first two tests, and the second test is broken because we haven't done anything yet. And then it's skipping the last test because that doesn't have only. And I think at one point I'm just going to take the onlys out. So I'm going to put in the same response mock from before, because this is invalid data we want. So we know if I put in this stuff, it's the date is 2020 0201, and because that's today's date in this test. Like anything today's date and earlier should fail. So if I'm going to write the text, I'm going to write invalid, and then I'm going to do range response mock. And now we're going to just run through. So I'm going to copy and paste some of this stuff because we kind of want to expect the same things. So we want to expect the hello world, and we want to expect that, and then we're gonna basically expect I think the get by role and the text element, so the text input. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. So this is all the code we had before, right? And then the next thing we're going to do is fire event. So the text, yeah. So so we're going to fire event. So it's going to be, we want to act when we do the fire event. And That's because like we're running the act, and then after the click happens, we're going to run the assertions after. So if we didn't wrap it in act, it would try to run everything all at once, and then the assertions wouldn't work like the way you kind of expect it to. So we have fire event dot click, and then I'm just going to get the submit button here, and then I'm going to do screen get by role, and then I'm just going to do that. So that's the fire event. And then I want to see if error exists. So like just for some visual here. So we want to expect that these two errors on the page. So the first one is, so this is where we go. We want to expect that it's to be visible. And then we're going to expect the next one, which is this one. And then expect to be visible. Okay, let's see how this works. Yeah, so that test passed. Like basically the form's invalid. So the next one is like, we should have a success message with valid data right here. So I'm going to take out the onlys. I'm going to take out that only, and then I'm going to take out this only. And then now it should run all 3 tests, and then it should be failing. So we're going to pass in the same response mock with that old date. And the text. And we're going to pass that in here. And we're going to just go in and enter the correct data. Click the submit form, and then we're going to, at the last stage, make sure errors are not present and check for success message. So yeah, we want to enter correct data. So if I go here, so I'm going to do that, I'm going to also fire event, right? So I'm going to fire event, and then this is where it gets a little tricky. Yeah, so it's a comma, and then you're going to have to, you know, when you enter an event, there's like a target with a value in JavaScript. So what is, let's see, I think it's, we want it to be after, like way in the future. So that's the first one. And then we're gonna fire event change. So this is loaded, this is invalid data here. This is, this date is after the date we mocked. So just to scroll up. Oh, we haven't mocked the date yet. Let's see if this passes. Okay. I think it'll pass, but we'll go into that in a minute. So I want to select this good text box. And then after that, we're going to have a target with a value of something. Okay, so just going to see how it's going. It should fail. Oh, it's like passing. Why is this passing? It's passing because we haven't expected anything yet in this test. So that's why it's passing. But we're going to click the submit form again. So we're going to fire this event. And I'm just going to click it here. And it should still be passing because we haven't done any expects yet. And then we're going to make sure the errors are not present. So I just want to show you something here. Because so I think what's it to not be visible? Is that a thing? You can also do not to be visible, right? And then we have this other one, not to be visible. And then this is going to fail. Received element is visible, right? So yeah. So this is still erroring. And I think it's erroring because we haven't mocked the date. So which one is failing? Yeah, date is invalid. So let's go and mock the date and see if that fixes it. We haven't mocked the date yet. So this is a little complicated. So it's a const date now stub. It's going to be just function new date.
Have you found that there were any particularities when you come to mocking a date? I always get super nervous when I'm working with dates in JavaScript or like anything. I always think like, oh yeah, it's time. This is going to be hard.
Yeah, I think it sucks if like you're actually using the time part of date. That's when like you have to start digging into just docs and like looking at timers and stuff. And then yeah, like 80% of the time, the thing you have to mock most is today's date, which is why I'm just like only trying to mock global date with a capital D, because it's like the date API. And then that should be date now stub. And then we're gonna do global date now, and we need to reset that. So we're gonna do const real date now. So after all our tests, we want to return it. So we're going to do date now, find global.date. And then it's going to be global.date.now. We're going to set it back to the real date after this test. Okay. So let's see how this works. If not, we're going to have to do like a little bit of debugging. Okay. Unable to find an element with text date is invalid. Okay, so now you can see the cool thing about testing library, it spits out what you're actually seeing. So this is actually the success message. And I think, yeah, you can't actually use get by text to test if something's not on the screen. So that's like this weird thing in Jest that's sort of like buried in the docs. So you actually have to make this query by text. And if you do query by text here and here, yeah. And then we don't want it to not be visible. I think we're just going to do to be null. Because you see, it's like, it's not getting not to be visible. Like that's apparently how you don't test. You just test that it's not there, that it's null. And then that passes. And then we're just going to do one final check for the success message. So we're going to do expect. Let's go to this form and fill out some valid data so we can get the success message. Just bear with me. I'm going to do a date in the future and type in hello and submit. And we're going to select that. So we're going to expect this. And we're going to go expect. So I just copied and pasted from the DevTools to be visible. And that's it. Yeah, and then a test pass. So yeah, that was like kind of the basics of it. We mocked a bunch of things. We have different ways to mock things. The hardest thing to mock are those use effects. So you have to do await, async act await, and that's all inside of a bigger async function. And then we did a mock implementation for that. So we set it up so we can mock our own responses depending on what the test is about. Yeah, that was a bunch of code. Any questions?
I see that there's one from Rachel. And this was like asked maybe 15 minutes ago. It might have been like earlier on. You're arranging something like, is it because other data depends on previous data? It needs to be under the arrange function. And this might have been when you mentioned where you put the fake fetch.
Yeah, so I guess, so There's other data depends on previous data needs to be. So a range function is just like kind of to reduce a bit of boilerplate. So I could reduce it like even like if I wanted, I could stick those expects in the range too. But the range is just kind of showing you like before each test run, I'm actually, I have this mock implementation of fake fetch and I'm rendering my form. So it's just kind of a way of like extracting out that code to make your test code like more readable. Even here in like, let's see, this error stuff. This stuff was tested in the previous form. So you can even like delete that because here in this test, you're actually loading invalid data. And like, all you want to do is show this. It's like, hey, if we load this with invalid data and we click submit, the test is going to fail. So that's almost even a cleaner way to express how that test works. Yeah. So the arrange function is just a way to kind of take out test setup code that's not related to your test, if that answers the question. The next question is like, if you're going to change the writing on your UI, do you change the test code first or the UI code? So I would change the UI code. So, because like, it's okay for your test to fail, right? It's just knowing how it failed and why. So let's see. If I add in some more text here, my tests are going to fail, right? Because I've added in some text at the end of that, right? So it expected hello world, but it should really see hello, hello. And then I just go and like, I update my tests. So I go to that hello world.
And I feel like what this question is hinting at is like, how do we think of what to provide our test cases? You know, like, you know, do we mock something? You know, what's the difference between a fake and a mock? And talking to other developers, it seems like they do mocks a lot. Like I'll give like mock of a component instance, and give it this so-called fake or mock props or text, check that it works, and then I'm able to clean up that mock, and then I don't have to use the real component. Don't have to make the real API call, the fake fetch, right? So then I'm not like, in a way, like using what is there for my software to run. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I guess for me, when I think of tests, the things that I mock the most, especially on Unity tests, are like side effects. And like, so for me, anything in the use effect, that's usually side effects. Like I think of side effects are things outside of like, you know, props, and then you render your component, all the stuff outside of that. So like if I'm using these, like if I'm using a library and I'm testing this form, I'll probably like mock that library. And then like local storage, that's like some stuff that's happening outside of your React component. So I mock that too. And then the third-party library, like I say window fake third-party library, but most of the time that's window Google Maps or something, like you want to mock that. So that's for very Unity stuff. And then I guess you'll try to mock less and less for your integration tests. But by mocking less and less, I would mean more like, if you see this form, I wrote just one big gigantic form, which you shouldn't really do. But like, imagine these are all like React components inside of the form. So instead of a form container, like I actually have form here, I have a form input. If I was using those React components, I don't want to be mocking that stuff. So if you have a parent component with child components, you ideally don't want to mock that stuff, but you want to mock stuff happening outside of that. So local storage is never, it's usually outside of the app, so you want to mock that. Until case, do you prepare mocks with all kinds of language? So previously, what the kind of mocks I've used for INTL, and they weren't written by me, but like we would just mock English and expect English in the test, unless you are specifically testing, like you might have specific tests to make sure the INTL is working, but usually INTL is like external library that you're using, and hopefully they've written tests for their own library. So you just want to make sure that some kind of string is showing up, and then we'll just test for the most common language. But that's kind of like the way I've done it in the past. Other questions?
I just had a quick one, if I could. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Just to clarify the last point about sort of like your test boundaries, where you have a group of components that are sort of functioning together. would you still like test those individual components in isolation, or would you prefer, especially maybe if the component doesn't have too much going on, to do that sort of like mini integration test where you are testing like a functional group of components together? Like, how do you personally sort of approach that, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, that's tough because like I think ideally you would test in as like integration test. So you would test all the components kind of together, like so test a whole page, but that can be kind of hellish depending on the amount of code that's being used to render a single page. I think like, yeah, like I try to have unit tests, especially like I wouldn't, I try to have unit tests for components that get reused a lot. And then components that maybe have complicated logic. I kind of try to write tests for that. So if you do that whole smart dumb React component thing where you have a lot of data fetching in your smart component, I would write a test for that. And the reason I would do that is to let people know all the complicated data fetching going on in that component. And then, but yeah, like I think the North Star is you want to test integration as much as possible and test them all together. But like, this is like a simple form, right? But you might have a complicated form that's making like 5 API calls and like, it's like fetching local storage. And then maybe it's going to talk to something on another page. And like, it'll take a lot of time to like set up that integration test. Like integration tests are definitely like, you want to do them, but it's like also way more expensive than writing unit tests. So just, I guess it's just balancing the time and like kind of the demands of your product, right? Like if you know it's really critical, I would try to write integration tests and push for it. That's a whole other, as was being discussed at the beginning of the talk, it's like getting buy-in for that's like really difficult sometimes, or sometimes it's really not. It just depends where you work.
If it's business critical, right? Like someone wants to log in, someone must enter their like, I don't know, Auth0, like multi-factor auth code, and then they must like see a whole bunch of stuff. Then yeah, I don't know. I feel like I would like be trying to do that in Cypress. But yeah, it seems like that happens more when like the UI is like more stable, or like that whole flow is like more stable.
Yeah. And then also like I have like 4 imports here, so there's not a lot to mock, right? But sometimes you'll open a file and there's like 20 imports, and then it's like, it turns out you have to mock at least 15 of those to even get your component to render. So I'm not saying it's easier. It's like, it is harder to test them all, like all those components together, especially depending on what's going on to render that page. But that is the ideal. That's what I'm saying.
100% hear you on that. I think just to dig at that a little bit, I think maybe what I'm looking to uncover is just like some general guidelines for where you would draw those boundaries between clusters of components that should be tested together.
Yeah.
The number of external dependencies seems to be like a big, like that seemed to be something that you honed on right away. And also the use of use effect and that effect trickling down to child components, that seems like a good way to cluster things too. I'm basing that purely on like what I've learned from listening to you, but I'm wondering if you had any more general guidelines for how you might go about sort of creating these like functional groups of components that really should be tested together and not in isolation.
I guess like the way I've done it in the past, like it would be great if you could do it by page, but if not, if you do the whole container like dumb component pattern, like I would do it by that unit. Like if that's kind of how you arrange your React components, because it's like, oh, I have this thing that's fetching all this data, and then the dumb component shall look like this after I fetch the data. I might test that, and I would test like the success fetching and the error fetching. Like what happens when there's an error state? How does that look? And like what happens if you can actually get through that, like for most of your smart components or your data fetching components, that would cover like a lot of your app. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just checking the chat if there's any other questions, but yeah.
I have a question, kind of a more general to testing than specific to Jest. I've done several tests, and it seems to me like a good thing to do in general, or at least that has been working for me a lot, is to write one expect per test case. Is that kind of a good thing to do, or it's just a general preference? Is there any guideline on that?
Yeah, I think that's kind of related to like your test statements. So
Yeah.
I was maybe trying to cram too much into a single test here, but it's because I only wanted to do 3 tests for the code along, because doing 12 tests would be too much. But for me, this particular statement, I was like, I want to render, fetch the data, and then check that the data from the API, local storage, and globals are all there. So I would have multiple expects for that. So
Got it.
yeah. So I think like if you think of expects as being like if we go back to the test title stuff, it's like kind of whatever you write your test for. Your expectation is like if you're expecting the form to be in an error state, you'll have multiple expects kind of thing.
Got it. It depends on what you expect from this definition.
Yeah. And then
Right.
this is where it comes to like writing testable code. So like if you have a component that does many things, then you're going to have to write many tests. So that's why you see people writing components that like you try to write components and functions that only do one thing or 2 things tops. Like even if you start to have more than 2 if statements, if it has conditional logic with 2 booleans in those 2 if statements, that's when your tests start to get really, really hard to write. So yeah.
I've been given similar advice too, in terms of like keeping the components and the functionality small. Part of it is like a desire to have things done quickly, and the other part is like the smaller you make your increments of changes, and the smaller you make your increment in terms of the features you add to your code, the easier it is to test, and the faster code reviews go, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a school of thought. That might not be the best way forward, but I've been given that advice.
This is like kind of a random thing, but like if you've ever gotten a take-home test, like have people ever used Create React app for their take-home tests? Like,
Definitely me.
yeah, like you should make sure that you delete the test that comes with Create React app now, or you make it pass.
Absolutely.
So that's just like a kind of little public service announcement, because like, yeah.
Or like
Cheat
try to
code.
augment it.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen quite a few like submitted stuff where like people just hand it in with that test that's failing, and it's just like, yeah, it's pretty. Yeah. Any other questions about the code? Like, I know we didn't cover like how to mock all the things, but I tried to cover like the main use cases, like window, local storage, other people's libraries. Like,
If I'm not wrong, the last time I used Jest, I remember there was something called Snapshots. I don't see them in the documentation right now. Is
Oh.
that still a thing there?
yeah, so I skipped over
Was-
that because snapshots are a little contentious. So I kind of hate snapshots, and
I find them a bit weird, and even the use case to me, I'm not clear in that. I was about to ask about it.
I think one thing, okay, so there's one thing I want to talk about here that I want to, oh yeah, so I use this a lot. So sometimes when I'm debugging, I'll do this. So I'll do this, and I'll do to match inline snapshot. And you'll see what happens when it runs. Now where did it go? Now I have to do search. Yeah. So I use to match inline snapshot a lot. If my tests are failing, I'll use to match inline snapshot to see what's actually getting printed out, or I'll use debugger. But sometimes, yeah, depending on what you're testing. So like I'm of the opinion that snapshots should be small and ideally inline. And but there's other people who feel different, but it's just, for me, it's like I've been on a lot of like, I've worked at a lot of places where it's like snapshots are failing and people just hit update and then it passes and they're like, cool. So it's like, yeah. But it's like, yeah, you don't always have a lot of like control of getting rid of snapshot testing, but it's in my experience, they fail for reasons not to do with your code. So like if I write form and my snapshot test is failing, it's not necessarily to do with the code I wrote in the actual component or the front end. Like sometimes it's failing because of some random thing, like a random bug in emotion or Babel emotion or Babel style components or something. And I forgot the word for it, but it's basically like your test is failing and doesn't have to do with like something you did. And that happens a lot in snapshots. And also, as your app gets bigger and bigger, snapshots take a really long time to run. Yeah. But where I work, I also like, we also get to use chromatic, and like to be fair, it's not every,
It's great.
yeah, it's great, but it costs money. So like, depending on where you work, they're not gonna wanna use it. But chromatic, it takes pictures of like your storybooks. And then if you have something like chromatic, sometimes people even do their data fetching in Storybook, which sounds weird, but then it gives you really cheap visual regression testing in like chromatic. And then you don't have to worry about the false negative that you get from snapshot testing. But it is like kind of pricey. So not every business will. I think there's another version. It's like this app called Percy, which is also supposed to be really cool. So maybe I have to type in Percy testing or something.
And these are great for like visual testing, but also visual regression testing. So like hanging on to that like last version that was snapshotted, comparing the changes. There's always going to be a human component to it when you have to like realize like what is the intended change or not. But if you compare like the time you spend trying to use just snapshots to capture that and all the devices that you're gonna like actually account for, it's probably better and more worth it if you use chromatic.
Yeah. And it's also cool because then your designers, like you can set up your CI so the PR is blocked until your designers approve that there's no visual regressions. So it's a good way, like if your team's like 100% remote, a good way of working asynchronously.
I have a question, like what did you mean by inline slapshot as opposed to like, I don't know, maybe a block level snapshot? I've seen this like method before, but I didn't know exactly what it meant or did.
So inline snapshot will just print out the snapshot right here in between the two quotes. So that's kind of what I like about it. Because like otherwise, if you have to match snapshot, it'll create a new folder and then put the snapshot in that folder.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But then the cool thing with inline snapshot is like, usually you won't want to use this for a really, really, really long snapshot. You'll just use it for like a little part, right? And then because of that, ideally what you're matching in here or like your snapshot is really tiny. And when it's tiny, it's easier for you to visually see like what's changed or what's broken. Like if to match inline snapshot fails here, like you'll be able to tell, like if I take out like some of the text, match inline snapshot will like print out something different here, and then you'll see an error message down in your terminal. I use it a lot when I'm like debugging data fetching stuff, because I'll be like, oh, is this actually fetching the thing I'm looking for? And then I'll like print out a snapshot of like the data.
That makes sense. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Awesome.
Yeah,
Oh.
like people who lasted till the end. That's good.
Yeah, it was very cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you again, Nicole. This has been awesome.
This is great. This is a real developer at work, and 10 times less the head bashing that you witness on a normal day of me trying to figure out how to mock or fetch or any of this. Yeah, like at some point, some client, someone's going to ask like, what are you guys doing for quality standards? And then they're going to expect this like test strategy kind of thing. So this is really like a summary of like that experience.
Yeah, it's been really great. And I really appreciate, Nicole, you always bring the biggest crowds out. And we truly appreciate you taking the time to prepare this talk and do the talk. Folks, if you haven't already, join Slack. If you're interested in doing a workshop of your own, you know, maybe you're a little bit scared, maybe this is the first time or anything like that, don't worry about that. We can coach you through it. Reach out to me or Jen. Once again, thank you so much for showing up, coming out. I know everyone's, eager to get back into in-person events as we are, and that will happen as soon as we can. Jen will eventually feed her cat. It will
He's
happen.
on the ball. My cat does this when he's real hungry and I'm ignoring him. Training by, cats don't operate in an operant kind of training. They you can train them by ignoring, and I've trained him to sit for food. So we have an understanding.
I hope everyone had a great time. I hope everyone to see everyone again at the next JS workshop, which will be next month. The next event is going to be JS Social. It'll be the 30th of June. Feel free to come out to that. It's a great event. Have a good night. If you have any feedback, please reach out to us. Thank you for coming, and awesome.